part of, I think, accepting the risks of a vaginal breech birth, which aren't much different than the risks of a head down birth, just slightly higher in some areas, is just coming to terms with the fact that we have to accept risk. We have to accept that we can't control, we can't guarantee outcomes, we can't expect perfection. But that's a really good attitude to take for any birth, really, not just a breech birth. It's just a little more pronounced because our culture has so much of a stigma and a fear surrounding breech birth that you have to be a little more explicitly willing to face risks because everyone around you is going to be talking about risk. Even though there's benefit, there's a lot of other things. Risk tends to dominate the conversation.
This week's reviewer of the week is Carolyn0523. She says, best birth podcast. I am obsessed with this podcast. During my pregnancy, I listened to every episode and I felt so much more educated on birth and prepared for it. Would recommend it to any pregnant mom. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your review. And today I have a very special guest. Her name is Rixa. She is with Breech Without Borders. And she's just a fabulous, incredible person that is here to talk to us about breech babies today. So really quick, Rixa, will you take a moment, introduce yourself, say hello? She's got an incredible bio, you guys. It's long. And so I'm going to put all of that information within our show notes so that you can go read about her and click on all the links. But Rixa, will you take a moment and say hi to everybody?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rixa. Let's see, where do I start? I think I'll start with the fact that I have 4 children. And I used to say I have 4 little children, and I was in denial for a really long time. I can't say that anymore. 3 of the 4 are now teenagers. I'm in the nostalgic, sad phase where I'm really sad that I'm done having little ones. And it was bittersweet to accept that. But so I have 4 children, not so little anymore. 3 of the 4 are taller than me, and I'm not short. So that's a change to go through. I have a PhD in childbirth and American studies. And I've started out in the worlds of investigating midwifery and home birth and unassisted birth. Those were my first specializations coming out of my program. And then over the years, I've transitioned into studying breech, and now it's my full-time specialty. And I started Breech Without Borders almost 6 years ago to the day on May 11th, 2018. And it's just taken off from there. So now I work full-time with Breech Without Borders and kind of do a little bit of everything for the organization. So I'm the president and founder. So I do anything from website design, graphic design, fundraising, bookkeeping, taxes, accounting. I do all the course development, video editing. I do some teaching as well. I do all the research and kind of research analysis and research updates for the organization. Do all the course curriculum, course content creation, all that stuff. So it's a busy life. I also just finished writing the 2nd edition of our book, which is 550 something pages, and did all the editing, writing, graphic design, book layout. So it's been a lot of work. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. I live most of the year in France and then some of the time in the US. We are raising our 4 kids bilingually here. So they go to public school in both places and just kind of sink or swim every year. It's worked out well so far. So we have a little bit of a crazy life, but good for our family. And, I do some academic stuff and publishing and writing articles. Those are in the bio, but, mostly I'm just doing breech now and really trying to make breech birth accessible, understandable, and information widely accessible to everybody.
Yeah. And I'm grateful that you do what you do. And I can relate to you on that teenage. There's a part of me that's like, oh my gosh, I think I've hit the stage where I'm actually going to be in a couple years looking forward to grandbabies rather than, talking about my own babies, which is crazy. And I say a couple years and I hope we have, a little bit distance for that. But it is different kind of moving into that next stage and still working with moms who are early on. Your PhD, do you mind if I ask where and how you ended up studying that? Like what got you into that?
Yeah, so I did it at the University of Iowa in a program that's called American Studies. And to be honest, it's a program for people who love doing a bit of everything and can't make up their minds. I joke about it. I came in thinking I was going to study something doing with food and culture. I wasn't really sure what I was going to study. And within my first semester, at the end of the first semester, I had a conversation with a fellow grad student who had just had her baby over Christmas break. And she said something about wanting to have a home birth, but she couldn't find midwives at the time. Midwives in Iowa were illegal. Home birth midwives were. And she said that she had midwives at the hospital, but it was a really bad experience and just would never do that again. And I was like, what? midwives are not legal? What? Home birth is not legal? I had no idea about any of this whole world. It was completely new to me, but I was looking for a research project and I said, oh, why don't I write about home birth and midwives in Iowa for my semester research project? And um, I picked up a whole bunch of books. I just went on to the Dewey Decimal System, researched home birth and midwives and all the books I could find in the library and just checked out a whole stack and started reading. And the very first book that I read was Peggy Vincent's Baby Catcher, which is a memoir of a home birth midwife who worked in Berkeley in the 80s and 90s. So, some crazy stories being a home birth midwife. And I read that book and I was like, this is my life calling. I'm going to do birth. That's it. I knew it like immediately. That was it. So my program is multidisciplinary and everybody basically gets to create their own program of study. You have a few core courses that you all take, but most of it, you actually go through the entire course catalog. You have to choose courses from many disciplines and you put together a PhD program of your own, basically. So I drew from medical anthropology, history of medicine, health communications, maternal child health, public health, all those sorts of courses that have to do with healthcare and medicine, and especially maternal health, because I knew that was going to be my specialty. And created a PhD out of it. So it was just this set of happy coincidences that everything fell into place at the right time and being in a program where I could choose my focus and really narrow it. So I came out of it with dual specializations in one was maternal child health, healthcare medicine, all that stuff. And the other, I had to choose a different field. So my other one was U.S. environmentalism, environmental history, because I was also very interested in environmental issues. So that's where I came from. And that's how I got started academically.
That's so neat. Jumping into the breech information here. So for women who are listening and maybe first-time moms, or maybe they just never heard the term, what is a breech baby? What constitutes a breech baby?
Yeah, a breech baby is simply a baby that is head up rather than head down. So you can have different things coming out it could be the butt, it could be the feet, or really, really rarely the knees. But it just simply means that the baby is head up rather than head down when it's coming out. Yeah.
Okay. And what causes a baby to be in that position?
So honestly, most of the answer is we have no idea. So sometimes we can point to factors that are probable causes, like if you have a uterine anomaly, a bicornuate uterus, unicornuate uterus, various kinds of septum in the uterus, that can predispose you to having a breech baby because the shape of the uterus is a little more constrained and it's harder for it to navigate head down. There can be some genetic factors, but most of the time, honestly, we don't know. Sometimes it's related to some abnormality in the baby, maybe low tone due to Down syndrome or to some kind of neurological condition that we don't know about. But, most of the time we still don't know. And you can theorize all you want, and we just don't know why that many of these babies choose to be breech. Sometimes there's an obvious answer after the fact. We might see an extremely short cord or a cord that is so wrapped up in the baby that it just didn't have the chance to turn because it was tangled. But a lot of the time, it's just a mystery. We don't know.
Do you find in all of the places that you work with all these women that have breech babies, do you find that like it's more prevalent in the United States versus somewhere else or anything like that? Like I've heard body posture and, different ideas behind why a baby might be breech or not, even just the fact that we sit in chairs all day. So do you have any thoughts behind that?
That's an interesting question. I was reading through a chapter that we had a guest author in our book, Michel Audin, that many of you may know. And he mentioned that he thinks that there's a slight rise in the incidence of breech presentation over maybe the past several decades. So that's something that would be really interesting to follow if indeed we do have a slight rise in the incidence. It's usually around 3 to 4%. And it's pretty stable globally, but there is some population variance. If you look, I couldn't quote you anything without looking through the research, but the variance is still quite small. It's mostly still in the same margin. It's not like some countries are 12 and some are 1. It's mostly right around 3 or 4%, but you might have some populations that are more like 5, and more that are some that are trending more like lower 3s. I think the variance is more restricted to a couple percentage points.
It just makes me wonder too, because there's some things, for example, that I encourage moms to do, like posturally or whatever, like how we hold our bodies or even like a forward leaning inversion once a day or things like that. So are there things that you encourage moms to do or that you've seen are really positive to help encourage baby into a better position?
I don't even focus so much on the positioning and postural movements, although I think there's a lot of interesting like research going on with that. And there's a lot of people who are really well versed in, body work. So I would, my answer is I'm going to refer you to somebody who specializes in that. Because what we do is by the time people get to us and need our organization, we're focused on actually getting the skills to get this baby out vaginally and safely.
Fair enough.
So we're a little, that's just not as much my realm.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of stuff that people do, and a lot of it we have no idea if it's effective because no one's had the money to fund the research to actually, do a randomized double-blind controlled trial as you would need to do to actually see if it works. So, you can do all this stuff and maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. I'm also a little bit of the perspective that if we were in an ideal world where every maternity care provider had really good skills, then we could just stop fretting about it and stop wasting all this time and energy on trying to fix something that's not really a problem to begin with. It is a problem in our
I completely agree
society
with that
today because we don't have the skills to support it. But honestly, like so many women, you'll see like they do moxibustion, they do the cold ice packs, they go do handstands, they do inversions, they play music low down or high up or whatever. And, they do chiropractic and they do all this stuff. And they're so stressed trying to turn the baby that it just also can take away from the joy of the pregnancy. And with good reason, because they might not have any option but cesarean if their baby remains breech because they have no care providers. But it's kind of frustrating that I see women having to go through these extreme measures rather than just celebrating the baby's position and just enjoying the pregnancy, And so
I appreciate
that's my goal
that.
is like, can we create a world where we don't have to do all this crazy stuff unless you want to, but a world where everyone's like, cool, you're breech, great. I have tons of support. I have all my options. Great.
Yeah.
I think it would just
with that
pregnancy so much better.
So sorry. Yeah, I agree with you.
Oh, it's fine.
One of the things that I think is like super important, right, is that women find a supportive provider from the very beginning. We talk about that a lot. Where can they find, or how do they get information about looking for somebody who is well-versed in breech should this be part of their birth story? And I agree with you 100% that I think the stress and the trying to get baby to flip, which is a lot of, I get to help women with that as well because they don't have a provider nearby that can help them with that. So I think you're doing all the right things. And that's exactly what women are hoping for, is that I can just let pregnancy be what it is and have a really good supportive provider for whatever I need. So where are these providers that these women can find?
Many of them are in hiding, and that's only partially joking. And some of it's literally true. Some of them are very much underground. And even the ones who can do it legally, doctors or midwives who can do it above board, many of them don't dare let anybody know, except through like back channels, that they can support it because their hospitals have threatened them that if they do too many or if they do it on a regular basis, that they'll get fired. They'll lose their privileges. They'll be kicked out of their hospital or their group practices. So it's really frustrating because it's seen as this really taboo thing, like that you're doing something wrong, that you have to hide, when it should be celebrated for those people who have the skills and the training. Like they should be the ones who are getting like prizes for actually seeking out a skill set and becoming proficient and then doing something that is, requires a good amount of skill. It's not like cephalic birth. It's different. So how can you find them? So number one is we have a provider directory on our website, breechwithoutborders.org. I think it's just /providers or /directory. So we have a public directory for those who can make it more well known that they do this. And then we also have a private directory that I'm in charge of. And if you look in the public directory and you can't find anybody, then you can contact, there's a form you can fill out. It'll send it to me. And then I will look on the private directory and see if there's any other hits. And it just provides a little buffer to make sure that these names that they just don't want them publicly searchable, but they're willing to let me contact the women and put the two of them in touch. So, but it's an imperfect system because we rely on people to voluntarily submit their information. So it's only the people who know about our directory who are willing to be listed. So it's, fairly small relative to the number of providers in the world, but it's a start. So that's one place to try. I also really like networking with the Facebook group. It's called Coalition for Breech Birth. And it has like at least 10,000 members now. A lot of them are providers. And if you put out a call like, hey, I'm looking for a provider in this area, I'm due on this date, I want a hospital birth, but I'm open to home birth, you might get a lot of good recommendations from there as well. But let's be honest, there are so many places that you might have, you you might be lucky if there's one provider in your entire state who is willing to support it. And many states have no hospital options that we know of at all. And some states might have one or two, but only if that provider is on call that day and they make you do all the stuff like birth in the OR with an epidural. So there's so few good options for physiologic breech birth where you just go in, everybody's trained, you can have any position you want, and they're not going to throw a fit when you stand up or you get on your knees. They're going to be like, yay. So there's 2 hospitals that 24/7 support that I know of in the entire US, for example, which is really sad. I mean, we're 300 million people, 4 million births per year, and we have 2 hospitals where you can actually know you're going to walk in and find someone who knows what they're doing and will support you in any position. In a larger sense, there's scattered providers here and there who do it, but in terms of, a hospital that actually has a decent amount of staff trained, too. So we're trying to change that. Hopefully, by next year, it'll be a lot more than 2 and so on, and we can grow that.
Yeah, that's great. For moms who have a breech baby and say that they find a provider that does support this, and you guys train, as far as I understand, you train out of hospital and in hospital, just whoever is ready and willing to take the training. So do you find that one seems to work better than the other, one provider versus the other, or the outcomes are better for moms if you're out of hospital or in hospital? And kind of what can mom expect either way when she's working with a provider and preparing to have a breech baby?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have a data collection project, but we don't have a lot of people submitting their data yet. We're trying to track clinical outcomes after people train with us and then start to attend the breaches. So that's a question that I'm hoping in a few years we can answer with some real data behind it. I think that there's different constraints on different providers. So the ones in the hospital tend to be constrained more with their hospital administrative board, their risk managers, their peers who will sometimes won't, approve of them doing supporting a vaginal breech birth. But if they have a supportive environment, it can be really positive. Like we've trained some different hospital systems, and certain of the providers are now offering on a routine basis, vaginal breech birth among several of the people who trained with some really fantastic feedback. So we had one mom who was a home birther times 3 who had her 4th baby breech. And she went to one of these hospitals where we had recently trained like all of the residents and most of the OBs and midwives and had her 4th baby there. And she was just ecstatic about her experience because they were completely supportive, very hands off, let her do whatever she wanted to in terms of movement and positioning. And so it can be a really, really good experience if you have a well-trained provider and a supportive hospital environment, but that varies widely. It really, really just depends on each individual hospital. So it's worth talking, like if you have a doctor or a midwife who's in a hospital setting and who's done some training and is willing to support, just ask, like, what can I reasonably expect when I go in and have my baby? What are the rules that you're being asked to follow? Which doesn't mean that the woman has to follow them, but the providers have to follow certain rules, and the woman may or may not agree to them afterwards. But, do they force you to be in the OR? Are they okay? Can you stay in the labor room? Do they mandate an epidural, or are they more supportive of not having an epidural? Those kinds of questions to kind of really see what's going to happen if I actually have my breech baby at your institution. So in the US, so many of the breaches that are happening today are home birth because those are the providers who are a lot more willing to support it. And I know this kind of blows the mind when hospital-based providers see that we're training home birth providers because home birth itself is so taboo, and let alone a breech home birth. But it's just, no one's willing to support them in a hospital setting. So they're going somewhere to avoid surgery. And so, a lot of the breaches take place in homes, and probably a lot of the really experienced breech providers are often located in the home environment because that's where the breaches are happening. So it's just such a big country, though, in a big area that it's hard to generalize. I think it's just really good to ask a lot of specific questions, no matter your setting. So ask your provider, how many have they done? What trainings have they taken? How often do they practice? What kind of things do they do to keep their skills up? Because you can't get a lot of high volume practice for most people. Ask them what kind of difficulties they've encountered. It's nothing to be ashamed of if you've had a really difficult breech birth and you're open with it with your clients, being like, yeah, I struggled with one of them, or one of mine had to go to cooling or whatever. It's good to know that, and just to be really transparent and ask. It's not a mark of shame to admit that all your births aren't easy as a provider. And as a as a woman who's expecting a baby, it also is a reminder that you can't assume that everything's going to be fine. There's no guarantee with any pregnancy that you're going to walk out of it with a thriving baby, and a baby with no abnormalities. And part of, I think, accepting the risks of a vaginal breech birth, which aren't much different than the risks of a head down birth, just slightly higher in some areas, is just coming to terms with the fact that we have to accept risk. We have to accept that we can't control, we can't guarantee outcomes, we can't expect perfection. But that's a really good attitude to take for any birth, really, not just a breech birth. It's just a little more pronounced because our culture has so much of a stigma and scare, a fear surrounding breech birth, that you have to be a little more explicitly willing to face risks, because everyone around you is going to be talking about risk. Even though there's benefit, there's a lot of other things. Risk tends to dominate the conversation. So yeah, I think I veered off a little bit with your question, but I hope I answered the main parts that you wanted to cover.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that's kind of the thing we take on as moms, is that responsibility. You know, if you do everything that the doctor's saying, something goes wrong, well, then you did everything that you could. It's not your fault. But if you go against that grain at all of a sudden, it's all your fault. Never mind that the risk existed either way. And you should have a say as the mom. So I think that's really important, what you talked about. For moms who are preparing for a breech birth, is anything different for them? And once labor begins, what are the differences, or what does it look like for a mom going through a breech delivery?
Yeah, we can say that labors really don't differ significantly. I mean, labors vary widely, right? From one birth to another, one woman to another. But there's nothing that we can point to and say a breech labor is going to be, for example, a lot faster or a lot slower. So there can be a big amount of variation, just like with a cephalic birth. Some are going to be really straightforward, really textbook. Some are going to have stops and starts and plateaus, just like a cephalic birth might. So, you know, it's funny when I talk with some highly experienced providers, sometimes they say, I really like having the primates have a breech birth because they don't know what to expect with a head down baby. So they have no reference point. It's all new to them, and they're not expecting it to feel like a head down baby. So sometimes it can be nice to have no experience and just have your baby, because it's your first birth and it's all new anyway. So you just take it in stride. Once we get to pushing, and especially once the baby starts to come out, that's where it gets really, really different from a cephalic baby. So in general, the pushing urge might feel different, because when you have a head down baby, you have this great big round hard thing coming out, and it stimulates all sorts of nerves in your vagina and your rectum, stimulates that really strong fetal ejection reflex, the feeling that for a while the baby's coming out of your butt, before it gets low enough. And you're like, no, seriously, this baby's coming out of my butt. Every time it felt like that when I had my babies, and then it came lower, and then, then you could feel it coming out of the vagina. But, there's those really strong feelings. And typically we tell people you might not feel that same crazy strong urge to push in the same way. And if you feel it, it might be really, really late, like once the baby's butt is actually starting to come out, because it's softer, the tissues of the butt or the legs. It's not this hard round thing. It's softer, squishier stuff. So you might have a slightly different feeling of an urge to push, or a delayed urge to push. And that's fine. You just kind of follow your body's cues. And if you're not feeling pushy, then that's fine, even if the baby's almost coming out, So a lot of it's just kind of going with the flow of what this labor is happening, but it might feel a little bit different if you had some head down babies. And once the baby starts to come out, so once the rump of the baby, the butt is emerging and it's out past the hips, that's the point of no return. And from there, this is what we tell not just moms, we also tell providers: forget everything you've ever learned about cephalic birth. Breech birth is completely different at this point. And one really big difference is the more of the baby that is out when a baby's breech, the less that the top of the uterus, which is called the fundus, is actually making really good contact with the baby's head and pushing the rest of it down. It's different. In cephalic birth, you have the head that comes out. Usually there's a pause. You wait for the next contraction. The uterus kind of gets behind the butt, and the next contraction, the rest of the baby comes out. But the breech baby, you can have the baby halfway out up to its belly button, its nipples, its shoulders, or even its neck. And you might have, your head's here, and your fundus, your uterus might be way up here, and just kind of empty space. It got left behind. And so if you wait for a contraction to get the rest of the baby out with a breech birth, you might be waiting indefinitely. So one thing we like to tell moms is once the baby's halfway out, just push the rest out. It's going to be all on you. It's going to be your pelvic floor, your vaginal muscles, your abdominal muscles. it's going to be your vagina power. That's what we like to say, that gets the rest of the baby out. You're not going to sit around and wait for contractions once the baby's halfway out. You just push it out, because those contractions probably won't come. Or if they come, they're just going to start releasing the placenta way up above the head. So it's your job to push it out. Don't need to wait anymore. Once it's halfway, just go ahead and push, get the baby out, push and move. So those are some of the biggest differences. We've seen a lot of people expecting a breech birth to be like a cephalic, and they tell the mom, okay, wait for the next contraction, and they sit and wait and wait and wait and wait, and baby's not moving, nothing's moving. And sometimes babies can tolerate that, but sometimes they don't like it. They don't like sitting there for several minutes waiting, because at the very, very end with a breech baby, once the baby's coming out of the maternal pelvis, you can assume that the cord is probably getting pinched somewhere, especially as it's, just the head left inside, because you have this, big round head and you have a bony pelvis, and you likely have some cord compression. And that's why you don't want to sit around and wait forever, because at some point the baby needs oxygen, and you just want the baby to get born so it can start breathing, especially if there is some compression. So we just say, okay, go ahead and push, get this baby out. And the providers that we train, hopefully by now, should know we don't sit around and wait for that last contraction. If it doesn't come, then you just have mom move and push and do what she needs to do to dance the baby out.
And so is there anything that a provider does during that time if mom is pushing but nothing is happening, or once baby is out, what's the provider doing during that time?
Yeah. So during expulsion, the provider's main role is to be very, very observant and to really carefully watch all the steps that's happening. Babies do really predictable things when they come out breech. They come out a certain way, they rotate a little bit a certain way. So you can kind of predict in advance what you should be seeing next. And if you don't see that next thing, then you say, something's stuck or something is holding it up. What is it? So the provider might, for example, if they see that there's like a long delay in no more descent, baby kind of gets stuck somewhere, they might ask you to try changing positions, to try pushing harder. Sometimes just moving the maternal pelvis in different ways can open it up, combined with some really good pushing efforts, and that can keep the process moving again. There's some things they can do. For example, if it's a more urgent situation where the baby's declining really rapidly and not coming out quickly enough, at the very end, they can do something that's called fundal pressure, which is where they'll put their hands on the top of the fundus and just give you a little extra boost of power with the contraction, or even sometimes between contractions if it's more urgent, which just helps to push the baby down. This is done just, once the baby's already halfway out, or, basically coming out or halfway out. So there's some things they can do that are still pretty non-invasive, but we start with maternal movement and positioning and more vigorous pushing efforts first. And if that doesn't bring it, they can do things like fundal pressure if they feel it's warranted, to bring more progress more quickly. And as a last resort, if something is truly stuck, the most common thing, for example, are arms to get hung up in funny ways, or the head to be a little bit tipped upwards and needing to flex like this to be able to fit through. There's maneuvers that they learn to bring the arms down or to help the head flex and come out. So it's not super common that you need a maneuver. It varies from birth to birth, but I think a good average is to expect that 70% of your vaginal breech births, if they're in an upright position, okay, not lying down on the back, but upright, moving around, 70% will just fall out with no intervention needed. And 30% might need some intervention. And most of that's pretty minor, like something called a shoulder press, where they press on the baby's chest like this backwards, and it flexes the head down and helps the head come out. That's the most common maneuver needed if something is. And then occasionally, maybe 5 or 10% of them, they'll need a bigger maneuver, like going in and bringing arms down, or rotating the baby to help the arms come, or reaching in to help the head flex internally rather than externally. And, this varies by provider. Some places have a little bit higher rate of maneuvers. Some places have lower. It depends on your training, your skill level, all those things. But, you can still figure that most of the time it's just going to come out, especially if you're able to move and really respond to your own cues and take the positions that work best for you. Babies will mostly find their way out without any need for touching or interference.
That was going to be one of my questions, actually. What about for moms who are choosing to have an epidural? And is that something that you do not recommend for breech births? If you know you're going into a breech, do you recommend actually you're going to really need to be able to move your body and listen to whatever, even more so than a head down baby? Do you have any ideas there?
Yeah, we would really recommend trying to avoid an epidural, but we wouldn't go so far as to say you shouldn't ever, because, we recognize that for some for some people, like there's just a certain level of willingness to feel the certain sensations, But the thing is, we know that epidurals are associated with worse outcomes in a vaginal breech birth. So there's that piece of information. And we also know that supine positioning is associated with worse outcomes than with being upright for both mother and baby. So this doesn't mean that you can't use epidurals, but it means that you should really have a good, true walking epidural if you're going to have one that allows you to change positions, to be able to stand or be on hands and knees, and to move around a little bit under your own power. And it's really interesting because some countries do really good walking epidurals and everybody can move around they maybe lie down for the first 15, 20 minutes to let it kind of take. And then after that, they're up and moving and they have some sensation. And then, some countries and some places, nobody's ever even seen a walking epidural. They're, in bed lying, they can't feel their legs, they can't move. And that's just how everybody is. So it really depends on your epidural technique, and it varies from one city to another, one country to another. And in some places, you can get a walking epidural, but you need to know what to ask for, and they will not offer it. You have to say, I want this kind of epidural. And then like, oh yeah, we could do that, but they would never offer it to you. So my suggestion is, yes, it would be better if you can avoid an epidural to avoid one, because they're associated with better outcomes and easier births, faster births, fewer maneuvers, better maternal outcomes, fewer injuries to the baby. And part of that's because epidurals are often associated with being on the back. So ask well ahead of time, can I get a true walking epidural in my hospital where I'm going to birth, if you're wanting to birth at a hospital? And not only that, even if you have a walking epidural, are they going to let you get out of bed? Because some places, even if you have a walking epidural, they don't let you get up. They don't let you move or change positions, which totally defeats the point of the walking epidural if you can't move. So what we recommend on the provider end is, we shouldn't mandate them. We should never mandate an epidural. In fact, we almost suggest the opposite, but we should also never forbid. But we always want you to start small. Start with the least risky, most effective pain relief first, which is movement, positioning, and hydrotherapy. Water immersion, showers, do all those things first that have pretty much zero risk and all the benefit, and are very effective. You can try things like TENS units, sterile water injections in the lower back, depending on where you are feeling your labor sensations. You can do hypnotherapy. You can do, all those things that are non-pharmacological first, and then just start working your way up. If none of those are working to get you through and you're at the absolute limit, then don't go into an epidural next. Then next, try the next thing that's a little bit more like try gas and air if you have that nitrous oxide. Try maybe some injectable medications. Don't go straight from, oh, okay, I sat in the birth wall for 5 minutes, not working. Okay, now I'm going to get an epidural. Right. Try everything. And you might find that you get through labor and it's tough, but you make it through. And great. Then if you didn't have to go all the way up to the very big guns, which is the epidural, then that's great. And then just see how far you go. It's kind of like, let's just play it by ear, especially if you're not ideologically as committed to going without pain medications, but you also want to kind of facilitate the best birth and the best likelihood of a good outcome. That should be your approach. Is I'm going to try everything I can first, non-pharmacologically, and then I'm going to take little steps, and just go as long as I can. And then also, if you have an epidural, ask for it to be turned down at the end, so that even if at first it's stronger than you might have expected or needed, you can hopefully turn it down so that by the time you feel pushing is coming, you can feel some sensation and maybe regain some mobility at the end.
My next question would have to do with risk, because I know women want to know, if I choose to do this, what's the risk in having a breech baby versus trying to have my baby turned or with a head down birth. So do you have some information in regards to what the risk difference would be, and then what those complications that moms could run into are?
So in the risk conversation, it's important to realize that there's like at least 5 areas we got to talk about in terms of risk. So I'll talk about each of those 5 briefly. So we have short-term risk to the baby. We have short-term risk to the mother. Okay. And then we start looking long-term. We look long-term to the baby once it grows up and becomes a child and an adolescent. We also look long-term risks to the mother beyond the first few weeks, after the birth. And then we also look at her future pregnancies and future children and what risks there are that might accrue from various decisions. So the one that we typically think of, though, when we talk about risk is, of course, the risk to the baby in the short term. And that's what everybody almost always focuses on, usually to the exclusion of most other risk factors, which is a little bit sad because if you only talk about short-term neonatal risk, you ignore a lot of other things that you're going to want to balance in this decision-making process. So you have risk in terms of mortality and morbidity. So morbidity is injury, and mortality, of course, is death. And so let's cover each of these really briefly. The best kind of estimates coming from like a, resource-rich country, like the US, Western Europe, those kind of places, right, is that if you have a head-down baby with a healthy, low risk, otherwise nothing exciting going on in pregnancy, and you plan to have a vaginal birth, you go into labor, you go through labor, and you have your baby, there's still about a 1 in 1,000 risk of your baby not surviving, just from all sorts of weird stuff. It could be a late-term stillbirth. It could be something that happens during labor. So, that's kind of the baseline risk of just going into labor, having a baby vaginally with a head-down baby. There's a little bit of risk. It's about 1 in 1,000, okay? I'm sorry, I'm just noticing that I have paint all over my fingers because as I was painting this morning. So if you're wondering, if any of you are watching this, I'm getting distracted by my lovely white fingers. So I just want you to keep in mind that the baseline risk is not zero. The baseline risk for otherwise normal, unexciting head-down pregnancy is about 1 in 1,000, okay? So the average risk of mortality if you have a breech baby vaginally is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 in 500, okay? Which is a little bit higher than 1 in 1,000, right? So it's, if you put it in terms of percentage points, it'd still be quite low, but it's not zero. And if you have a breech baby by elective C-section at 39 weeks, so you cut off the last couple weeks of pregnancy and you cut off labor and just have a surgery, that the risk of mortality in the short term is about 1 in 2,000. So, in the short term, you have a little bit less risk by having a C-section, even compared to having your head down baby vaginally, because you're bypassing several weeks of pregnancy during which, things can happen and you're bypassing labor. So what it shows us, though, is that, all of these risks are very small in absolute numbers, 1 in 2,000, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 500. It's still the absolute risk of anything bad going wrong is really quite low, but it's not zero in any case. Even with a C-section, we still have 1 in 2,000 babies that just dies for no reason, that doesn't survive. So what we tell people is, most women are willing to accept the quote unquote risk of having a head down baby vaginally. That's seen as an acceptable baseline risk. We don't tell all women who have head down babies that they should have C-sections because it's so risky, right? Although the way obstetrics is going, we're sometimes getting to that point. But, for most people, we expect to go into labor and have a baby. That's just a normal thing. And we don't see that as extraordinarily crazy. It's just seen as a normal thing that we do. So we accept the baseline risk of about 1 in 1,000. So the question with breech is, breech adds another additional risk of 1 in 1,000. So if you add them together, it comes into 1 in 500 for the overall risk. So what this tells us is that half of the risk of having a breech baby vaginally is just being pregnant and going into labor, regardless of the breech presentation. That's the 1 in 1,000. And then there's another 1 in 1,000 that's breech related. And the two together add up to be about estimated 1 in 500 overall. So some people will see any increased risk, even tiny, and say, there's no way I'm going to do that. I will do all the things to my body. I will take all the risk, and I won't accept any additional risk to this baby. And that's a response, especially in our culture today. And some people will say, what? Well, good gracious, knowing that I might have more children and knowing all the long-term risks and all the other things that we'll talk about shortly, that's not a hugely increased risk. I'm already taking a 1 in 1,000 risk by having my head down baby vaginally. So another 1 in 1,000 risk of the breech part, if I add that in, that's not such a big deal to me. So everyone kind of approaches this differently, right? Some people are more risk tolerant and some are more risk averse in terms of those absolute numbers. But of course, it's important to realize that we can't predict in advance which of those 1,000 or 500 babies is going to be the one that doesn't make it, and that's the hard part. And that's where it gets really tricky because, again, we live in a society that expects perfection. We're not used to dealing with death and accepting death or accepting a less than perfect outcome. And so we get really scared when we talk about these things. So that's the gross numbers in terms of, really large statistical numbers over many countries. That's kind of an average. But what we do find in the research is that the more well-trained a provider is, the lower that risk becomes, even of death or of injury to the baby. So in some countries where they do a lot of breech births, it's really pretty much exactly the same as a planned C-section because it's so safe, because they know what they're doing. So we can mitigate some of that risk and probably even make it safer with good training. Another part is the location of birth. Right now, we don't have really good research into outcomes of breech at home. And the research we do doesn't tell us much about what caused these things. The numbers seem to be higher in terms of the absolute number of deaths per 1,000 at a home birth versus a hospital birth. But that's also in the context of almost no hospitals doing it. And so there's very few people, there's not realistic access to a hospital birth either. So some of these women are kind of getting pushed into doing it at home because there's no other way to avoid surgery, even if they'd rather have a hospital birth if there were a skilled provider present. So it's a complex issue, and our goal is to make the training as good as we can so that no matter the setting, we can bring the risk as low as possible. So that's like just in terms of infant survival or of neonatal survival, but there's also the risk of like injury, right? You can have various birth injuries. Sometimes they happen during C-section, sometimes they happen during a vaginal birth. Anything from like long bone fractures, skull fractures, being in the NICU for several days, needing some assistance with breathing for the first few days, things like that. Most of these injuries are transitory or transient. They go away. Some of them are not. Some of them are long-term. So you might have a long-term brachial plexus injury. Sometimes that happens if you have a shoulder dystocia, for example, where the nerve, the brachial plexus nerve can get damaged and can reduce the infant's mobility in one arm. So, we have to also look at the risk of injury to the baby. And again, we see a pattern emerging that, yes, a planned cesarean section might have a slightly lower absolute number of injury to the baby, but the breech is not nearly as dangerous as most people thought it was. Like most of the numbers that your average OBGYN will cite to you are wildly inaccurate, and they're probably way over-exaggerated than what it really is. And we're finding the same pattern that in places that know what they're doing and that are well-trained, the rate of injury seems to be about the same compared to cesarean section, which is not zero in either case, actually. There's still some underlying injuries that you have. Cesarean section for breech itself is a risk factor for fracturing a bone. So, so it's not a guarantee either way that there will be no injury, but, again, maybe a slightly higher baseline rate, but again, it can be pretty low, and the absolute number is pretty low, and it can be lower with good training. So those are like short-term risks to the baby. And then you see how long it takes just to talk about one risk factor, and then we have 4 more left. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so let me just really quickly overview the other factors. So we have short-term risk to the mother, long-term risk to the mother. And in both cases, it's pretty well accepted that a vaginal birth is safer, for sure in the long term, and in many cases in the short term, because you're comparing a vaginal birth, which is usually a pretty healthy process. It's kind of biologically what our bodies were designed to do, compared to a major abdominal operation. So it's not surprising that it tends to be better on the mom, both in the short and the long term, in terms of her outcomes to avoid surgery. So that one's a pretty easy one to answer. There's also long-term risk to the baby as it grows up. Like, does being born vaginally breech versus cesarean breech have long-term health outcomes? And the answer is, overall, it seems to be pretty equivalent. But there's some interesting research related to cesarean section generally, not just breech related, but we know that being born by a C-section predisposes humans, like babies, but not just babies, but adolescents and even adults, to things like higher rates of type 1 diabetes, higher rates of allergies and other autoimmune disorders. So there's something about being born that really alters the basic biology and physiology of being human. And it's not very well researched. We're just starting to get some really good publications looking at these long-term outcomes. And that there's something that cesarean does that has negative health effects that persist over years and years and years. So it's another reason that, I think it's a good thing to try to avoid surgery, because it does alter a lot of things that seem to persist with the child as it grows up. And then finally, we have the long-term outcomes for the mother's future pregnancies and her next children. And that answer is unequivocal that if you have a cesarean for your first baby and then you have another baby, the next baby is more likely to die or have poor outcomes. And the next pregnancy is more likely to have potentially life-threatening complications, regardless of the mode of birth the next time around even. So what happens is that, you trade off some risk. If you have your first baby by C-section, because it's breech, that risk actually gets transferred to your next baby, and it sticks with you, with your body for the rest of your reproductive lifetime. So you actually have some small gains in mortality the first time around that we talked about, but that next birth, you actually have a higher rate of mortality if you have a previous C-section with your next baby. And it almost actually cancels itself out over 2 pregnancies. But again, this kind of risk counseling doesn't tend to happen. Women are usually told it's so dangerous. If you have your baby vaginally, your baby might die or be really injured. They don't talk about the fact that the next pregnancy, you're going to have a higher risk of your baby dying if you have a surgery. This is surgery the first time. So, it's a really complex balancing act because there's a lot of factors to look into it. Are you planning on having more children? Because if you want more children, you really want to avoid that C-section, so there's so many complex things that go into it. And a lot of the risk counseling that happens is not accurate. It's not up to date, and it's not even numerically or statistically anywhere near what the actual numbers are. Yeah.
With that, I'm curious, do you have this information or where people can read kind of scholarly articles or whatever evidence and stuff, information that you're pulling from where they can really educate themselves and feel good about decisions that they're making for their body? Do you have that on your website, or do you have places you can send women to get that?
Yeah, we have several ways of getting that information. So on our website, we have some free resources that have like some statistics and infographics. I also have somewhere I linked an article that I wrote that kind of summarizes this information I just told you. And that's free and available to anybody. Also, then we have some things like if you pay a small donation, you can access like an hour and a half long lecture that covers a lot of this risk and safety information. I also have a whole lecture just on outcomes of breech birth at home and what we know about the evidence. And then we also have various online courses that have a lot more in-depth information, and like these lectures plus other ones. We have some that are aimed for like parents and doulas and childbirth educators that they can take. And we're working on a course for parents who have a breech baby, like 37, 36, 38 weeks. They have a breech baby. We're working on creating a really good informed consent online course that would be like 1 or 2 hours that covers the most important information, risks, benefits, choices, how this process works, what it looks like, with the goal of it being something that's free and available to everybody, and that everybody would send them to this to take this short course so that they really understand the information, how things work, covers a lot of the questions they might answer. And then they can go back to their healthcare provider and say, okay, we've watched this Breech Without Borders course. Here's the questions we have now, but we have this kind of consistent base of information that's evidence-based, that's updated on a regular basis. And that's really easy to understand, but that still doesn't skip through the important parts. So that's kind of in the planning works. I have a lot of projects going on, but that's one of many that I'm trying to juggle and get made with the goal of, then that everybody who's having a breech baby can go to one place, get consistent information, and then come back and we can have a discussion once they've seen that information.
Well, I think that's so important because even for myself with my third baby, I was in a state where it was not legal. So the midwives were underground or they were not, registered in whatever way. And I did end up choosing to do that. I had a home birth with one of those midwives and it was great. But if that wasn't an option we were talking about, and my baby was breech, but I did not give birth, baby flipped and I didn't have to worry about that. But either way, if that was not an option for me, we were already talking about, do we need to cross state lines? What are the options? And I think once moms have really educated information, like when they can pull from this and that's the problem is we're not giving moms that informed consent, that real true informed consent that you're talking about. Because when you can really have the information and take that into yourself, then you can make decisions like, is it worth it for me? Because I don't have a provider here to fly to wherever and have my which it might be for some women, that really might be exactly what feels right for her. And it might not, but at least you have the opportunity to make that decision with good information. So I think what you're doing is just incredibly important. And I'm really grateful for you and for everything that you guys have put together, that website and the trainings. And I feel like you definitely have this movement going that is going to change lives forever. And I'm just really grateful for that. So thank you for everything that you do.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Along with that,
so now that we have our, Oh, sorry. I think we have a
Yeah,
lag.
no, go
Can I
ahead.
recommend too that now that we have our book, our second edition of our book coming out, it's actually a really fantastic resource for parents. We cover some of this risk benefit information. It has that article that I published in it. It has how a breech birth works, what it looks like, all the maneuvers. Like it's full of like it's probably about 3,000 pictures. It's graphically really inviting as long as you don't mind seeing pictures of women giving birth. But I think parents could actually find that as a really useful resource too. It's arriving in the US probably sometime in August. But if you're in a hurry, you can order it and write a note to us that you also want the PDF, and I'll send you the online version if you need it really quickly. If you're in an urgent situation, just you make a note and I can get you that. But that's another great resource. And it's you can pick it up and just look at the chapters that are useful, and you can skip the chapters that aren't useful to you. And I think that can give you a lot of preparation too into what this would look like and how it could work.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, most moms, especially when that is their situation, when they're coming up against it, like all the information they can handle, right? There's no like, you just want it all. So we'll put a link for the book as well in the website. And I'm so excited. I didn't realize you got a second one coming out in August. That's really cool. I also want to make sure that everybody knows that we'll have links for everything that we talked about today in the show notes, links to be able to contact Rixa and get onto her website and on all the information, her Instagram handles and all of that. Actually, if you want to share really quick, what are the websites and any of your social media where people can follow along and get educated?
Yeah, so we're breechwithoutborders.org is our main website. And then Facebook, I think it's just the Facebook/Breech Without Borders. Instagram, it's the same thing, Breech Without Borders. We're pretty easy to find. We have a Vimeo page. It's also, I think, called Breech Without Borders. I'd have to look up the links to be sure what the exact thing is, but it's all pretty much Breech Without Borders. You'll find it. So yeah, you're easy to find. And if you're interested in kind of following some of my crazy life, I blog at Stand and Deliver. And we'll link to that as well. But I've been blogging ever since I first got pregnant with my very first baby and was planning an unassisted birth, and started talking about why I was doing that. So I've been doing it for a while. And you can kind of follow my 4 pregnancies and all the other stuff that's been going on with my crazy life over the last 17 years.
That's awesome. Well, great. Thank you so much for your time today, for everything you're doing. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much.